system is unequivocal. And since the 1950s, many of the observed changes are unprecedented over decades to millennia. The atmosphere and ocean have warmed. The amounts of snow and ice have diminished. Sea levels have risen, and the concentration of greenhouse gas has increased. It goes on. Human influence on the climate system is clear. This is evident from the increasing greenhouse gas concentration in the atmosphere, positive radiative forcing, observed warming, and understanding of the climate system, end quote. And pathway for greater action. Dr. Diane Rogers-Healy, who is moderating the discussion, founded ACLW in 2000 to assist emerging and established women leaders and advance gender equality and outcomes. ACLW has been the focal point of significant achievements, including the establishment of the national awards recognising women's achievement in workplaces and communities, research and extensive writing on key issues including gender equality, legislation and the empowerment of women and organisations through leadership programs. And those awards were held in Parliament House here earlier this year. I hope you will be challenged and inspired by the discussion tonight. We want you to join this conversation in the Q&A session, which will follow the panel discussion. Now, I have the great privilege of being Diane's local member, and that's not just the reason why I agreed to host this panel tonight. As a Liberal Member of Parliament, many people might say, why would a Liberal be wanting to talk about climate change? Well, can I tell you, I think it is essential that more of us do. As someone who ascribes to Malcolm Turnbull's view of the environment, it is my very strong view that it is myopic of the federal government not to recognise that market-based problems have market-based solutions. And it is essential that this generation talk more broadly about solutions that don't just involve government intervention, but involve those that are the polluters taking responsibility for their actions. Indeed, I know that many of you would have heard the quote from Chief Seattle, "We don't inherit this planet from our parents, we borrow it from our children." And if we don't talk about the impacts, if we don't encourage businesses and companies to internalise their externalities, if we allow that old adage of the tragedy of the commons to run free, then what will we leave to our children? That was why I was so excited to... and again, thank you for coming tonight, and thank you for hosting this forum here in New South Wales Parliament House. Diane.
Thank you very much, Gareth. Before we start, I would also like to pay my respect and acknowledge the traditional owners of this land on which we're gathered, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and also pay my respects to Aboriginal elders past and present, and welcome any Aboriginal person present here today. Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for being here today. This event has taken about 9 months to plan, and it's delightful to see you here today. And I'm very proud and privileged and honoured to be introducing our panellists here, who I see as being extremely proficient in what they do and as change agents very influential in the climate space. So without further ado, let me introduce you to our panellist, Professor Lesley Hughes. She has served as a lead author on Working Group 2nd of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change for the 4th and 5th assessment reports. She's currently a counsellor for the Climate Council of Australia and acting Deputy Dean of the Faculty of Science at Macquarie University. In September this year, Lesley was awarded the 2014 Australian Government Eureka Prize for promoting greenhouse strategy. No, sorry, I'm onto the wrong page. Sorry, Lesley, you have to finish that line off for
promoting Australian science research.
Thank you. Please welcome Lesley. Laura Stocker. Laura Stocker developed and taught Australia's first university course in sustainable development at Murdoch University and developed the first state greenhouse gas audit for Western Australia in 1994. She currently researches and teaches at the Curtin University Sustainability Policy Institute and is Deputy Leader of the Coastal Collaboration Cluster funded by the CSIRO Wealth from Oceans and Climate Adaptation Research Flagships. Please welcome. multi-million-dollar company servicing thousands of residential, commercial and wholesale clients per year, helping them save money and reduce their carbon footprint. Jenny was selected as Ernst & Young's 2014 Central Region Emerging Category winner and is in the running for the 2014 Australian Ernst & Young Entrepreneur of the Year, to be announced in November. Please welcome Jenny. The State Government of South Australia, and now consults as an energy and climate change specialist. Heather designed the process which delivered Tackling Climate Change, South Australia's greenhouse strategy. She has helped the Premier's Climate Change Council deliver a climate change vision for South Australia and supported the development of the first Climate Change Act in Australia in 2007. Please welcome Heather. Susie Smith is Santos' General Manager, Carbon and Sustainability. She has over 20 years industry experience working with Santos for 10 years. Susie published Santos' first greenhouse policy in 2003 and Santos' first sustainability report in 2004. She was the Australian industry delegate on the Global Reporting Initiative Oil and Gas Sector Supplement. Please welcome Susie. And we have Amanda McKenzie. Amanda is the CEO at the Climate Council. She founded and led the Australian Youth Climate Coalition, which represents over 100,000 young Australians tackling the climate crisis. She was acknowledged as the 2009 Environment Minister's Young Environmentalist of the Year. Please welcome Amanda. When you got into this space right at the very start, I'd like to perhaps ask you to share what was the catalyst that drew you into this space? Perhaps 10 years ago or 15 years ago, and how has that catalyst since then changed as you've become immersed in the field of climate change? Perhaps does that start, Amanda?
Maybe not 15 years ago. The moment for me was in the end of 2005, start of 2006. I was on holiday in Tasmania, and I sort of accidentally picked up Tim Flannery's book, The Weathermakers, when we were at a bookshop in the Hobart Airport as we were going for our sort of trip and doing all these hikes. And I got to reading it while we were camping in the Styx Valley. And if you know the Styx Valley, it's these amazing, huge tall trees, sort of 75 metres tall. You have to lean back to see the very tops of them. And they've been there for over 400 years. They were there before Europeans knew Australia existed. And I had this real moment of thinking, I'm reading this book about how humanity can destroy all that we've built in our civilizations in just one generation. And I'm standing next to these trees that have been here for hundreds of years. How have we got it all so wrong? So I went back home and spent 6 months worrying about it and waking up in the night in cold sweats thinking about climate change, looking at other people on the bus thinking, do you not realise there's this climate change problem coming? And of course they didn't. There wasn't really much of a public narrative about climate change at that time. But in 2006 was the year that there was a real building of momentum. Al Gore's report came out, the Stern report came out, and I started an organisation that was basically around giving presentations to high school and university students about climate change, which then gradually morphed into the Australian Youth Climate Coalition. So my initial motivation was really from, we've just got to get people aware of this problem. I think when it became more real for me was later on when I went to the United Nations conference on climate change in Bali, and I met some Pacific Islanders there. And I had this experience where one of them came to speak to me after I'd given a presentation there and thanked me for the work I'd done. And she said, you know, my homeland in Kiribati is only a metre above sea level, and it's so vulnerable. And she talked to me about what it would mean if they had to visit their sacred sites by boat and not knowing if they were exactly in the right place, their ancestors' graves. And that really struck a chord with me of the human impact. This isn't about polar bears and ice caps, this is about real people and the issues that about if we can live our lives in the way that we want to, and about the quality of life of not just us here in Australia, of course, but people all around the world. So those are sort of two moments for me in the first year of getting involved.
How do I follow that lovely anecdote? For me, my first experience in it was in 97, 98, so I went to ANU and graduated there, and then moved back home to Adelaide. And then as a consultant, I started working on environmental impact assessment projects, mostly from more mainstream, what you consider water, biodiversity, all those sorts of issues. And then as a good consultant, you get shipped off everywhere. And one of the places I was shipped off to was Perth. And I was shipped off there. Don't worry, you'll be fine, it's only 3 months. And 2 years later, I finished a project over there, and that project was a major approvals project, but it was back. Senator Robert Hill was a Conservative senator, and it was back when the Kyoto Protocol was very new. And we were all sitting back working out how to deal with it. And I had the opportunity then as a young graduate in the workplace, leading this workshop, and we did some role modelling with, and I didn't realise at the time how senior the delegates were in the room, and to address the issue of climate change on a major infrastructure project. So back then, industry was starting to think about it and starting to get prepared and starting to understand what they could do to reduce their emissions. And so for mine, that was my early introduction to it, and I was very fortunate to be just at the right place at the right time. I also had a passion for coming from the environmental side. Then I, as a consultant, you finish up that project and you move back, and I ended up back in Adelaide and doing some consulting work, and then I was offered a job at Santos, and it was to manage their offshore environmental approvals, and one of my big passions is the marine side of things. And I thought, fantastic, I can commission all these cetacean studies and get out there and do some, basically go whale watching and get paid for it. And I was at Santos for maybe 2 months, and they said, Susie, you're doing quite well. This climate change stuff is pretty important. We'd like you to pick this piece up, and sustainability as well. And so I was given that opportunity at Santos. I said, okay. I knew the people there. I said, right, what have we got? And I said, well, we don't report our emissions, and we don't have a climate change policy. And we haven't produced a sustainability report yet, but you've got the full support of the board. I said, thank you very much. So we had a bit of a blank piece of paper, and so in those days, 10 years ago, it wasn't a normal thing to have a climate change policy. Corporates were just starting to do it. It wasn't typical to report your emissions publicly. And so what we did then is we put in place all of those things, and at that time, that put us at the forefront. We started pricing in carbon, we had energy efficiency programs, put in place a policy, and what's happened for us now is that the regulations caught up to where the leading edge of the, I wouldn't put Santos in the leader, but we're a fast follower. We're pushing out there and putting that in place, and that's what got me into it back in 2003-04, and then I've been heavily involved in it ever since.
Thanks, Susie.
I don't know why I was always interested in renewable energy, but I can probably point to my dad.
Can you hear Heather? Do I need to move the microphone?
But I can always talk louder. But I did my university work experience here at the University of New South Wales making solar cells with Dr. Martin Green. So I'd always flagged that energy was going to be my game. And my first decade I spent in industrial energy efficiency, which really opened my eyes. Having been brought up to think of industry as dirty and nasty, it opened my eyes to, actually we all rely on these things that we make, and it really gave me a strong interest in the economics side of energy policy. And when you look back at early climate change policy, it was breathtakingly naive, that we were pronouncing 20% targets for 20% cuts in emissions by the year 2000. It was back then an environmental issue. The environmentalists were starting to understand it. They were starting to say, let's put some targets around this. And it was when I guess Kyoto and some of that rubber hit the road, that people actually started to understand, and then the Treasury sort of bods started to get interested in this and go, actually, you're not setting a 20% reduction target, let's try for 108%, you know, and everyone was up in arms. But so I've always been interested in this. I came into the real climate change policy game under the Office of Sustainability. So having looked at energy policy, and energy policy was driven out of the oil crises of the 70s, coming into sustainability policy, that was the sort of popular thing back in 2003. And I was pointing to my colleagues saying, but having come from the energy game, you're all interested in energy savings because climate change is the biggest issue, I felt, on your sustainability agenda. And sure enough, a few years later, our unit changed from Office of Sustainability to Climate Change and Sustainability, and put that issue front and centre. And Mike Cran, as Premier of South Australia, really led that agenda and wanted that to be his calling card, just as Don Dunstan's calling card, his mentor, had been arts and a lot of social reforms years earlier. So that's been my journey in the climate change policy area.
For me, I always had an awareness and an interest in climate change and energy efficiency, but I've got to say it wasn't really until my husband and I were looking for solar panels for our home that I kind of had that pivotal moment when my future changed and brought me into the industry that I'm in. So we were always the type of people who tried to reduce our heating and cooling as much as possible, recycled our water, you know, used to fill up the washing machine, put it into buckets and then go water our backyard and all those types of things. And we wanted to get solar panels to help reduce our electricity. And we couldn't find any companies who actually had the information that we needed. We were both very normal white-collar workers. We couldn't afford solar panels. This was about 6 years ago. And it was a real challenge for us. So between my husband and I, we actually did some research ourselves, imported the panels ourselves, got an installer to come and do that work for us. My husband, who's got a very creative engineering type brain, also developed a tracking system to be able to get more out of the sun, and we built one in my dad's backyard, which I have to say is still there to this very day, so that's quite a success. And it was then that we realised that there are a lot of people out there who are exactly like us. They wanted to make a difference. They couldn't afford the products and the services that were out there for solar at that time. They didn't know who to trust. There wasn't a lot of good information out there, and so that was how our business started. So we had very low overheads, we were able to provide affordable products, we gave great customer service, we were very informative, and we've always looked at consultative-based selling, informing people about what options they had and what they needed so they could make the right decisions in regards to renewable energy in general. So we kind of built the business from there, and we've still maintained that client-based and consultative-based selling, and now we don't just look at solar, we look at how we can help people reduce their carbon footprint in many other ways, LED lighting and businesses as well as residential.
My background was in marine ecology. I did my PhD at the University of Sydney in subtidal marine ecology, so I spent 4 years thrashing around on the floor of Sydney Harbour, putting in little experiments with my scuba tank on my back, and that's where I first met Lesley, actually, at the University of Sydney.
Not on the harbour.
not actually underwater, no, but at the university. But by the time I'd finished the PhD, I had realised that if I wanted to make a difference to the marine conservation, I was going to have to focus much more broadly than just on scientific marine ecology. I was going to need to introduce the human dimension, the social dimension, the cultural dimension, the economic dimension, and try and consider all those things more holistically. So I finished my PhD and was then offered a job at Murdoch University as a lecturer with no job specification. and which was a great opportunity. So at about that time I came across the book by the Brundtland Report, Our Common Future, and I thought, well, this is interesting because here sustainable development is providing us with a framework that brings together the economic, the sociocultural and the environmental. So I sort of grabbed hold of that and set up a unit which I taught called Workshop in Sustainable Development. Workshop because I didn't really know what I was doing, and we just worked it out as we went along with the postgraduate students. And at the same time in Western Australia, there was quite a progressive government, and there were a couple of individuals in the Department of Premier and Cabinet who were really promoting sustainability and climate change, and they were developing a strategy on sustainability and a strategy on climate change, having just had a conference in 1988 on climate change in Perth. And so my first research consultancy as an academic came from those two individuals, Peter Newman and Richard McKellar, and they commissioned me to do a greenhouse gas audit in 1989, which I had no idea how to approach, and there was no methodology established. So I spent quite a few months just blundering around, working out what might be a good methodology for a climate change audit, a greenhouse gas audit, and developed that, and got some very interesting and revealing results about the levels of emissions in Western Australia, and we did that again a couple of years later. At the same time, I sat on the Renewable Energy Advisory Council in Western Australia, whose role was to promote renewable energy in WA. And Western Australia's got this huge resource in solar and wind energy for doing that, so we really should have been doing it a lot more than we were. But we've also got a lot of fossil fuels and gas and coal in Western Australia, so it was a bit of a struggle between the renewable energy supporters and the fossil fuel supporters, which of course goes on to this day. So eventually my interests in the marine sector and in the climate change sector came together, and for the last few years I've been looking at coastal adaptation to sea level rise, and that research has been, my role has been the deputy leader of the Coastal Collaboration Cluster, which is an Australia-wide network of academics, and we've been funded by the CSIRO to do our research, which has now more or less come to a close. We're just putting a few finishing touches on it at the moment. And that work was really about how to get climate science into governance. So we know there's a lot of good climate science out there, but how do we get it taken up into policy and accepted more broadly in the community? So that's it for me. Oh, and right now I've just started working on a climate adaptation policy for Curtin University, where I'm based. So that's an interesting challenge as well.
Well, I think I've probably been in the climate change space longer than any of the other people on the panel, but I got into climate change because I was sick of ants. Like Laura, I'm an ecologist by training, did my PhD on behavioural ecology of seed dispersal by ants, and spent about 4 years following ants around the bush, and I was really, really sick of that, and was looking around for something else to do and hopefully get a job. And my then PhD supervisor said, this was in 1989, so like Laura, a long time ago, said, well, why don't you think about doing something about climate change? And I went, oh, well, it's probably a better job prospect than ants. And so I've been in it ever since. So really I got into climate change from rather mercenary perspective, I have to confess. But I've stayed there, and I think once you get into climate change research and policy, you can't get out of it because it becomes such a moral imperative that you really can't turn your back on it once you're in it. And I think I've sort of stumbled from one sort of role to another. I think getting into it early was a great thing because there weren't very many researchers in Australia studying climate change impacts, particularly climate change impacts on biodiversity. So when there's nobody else to compete with, you sort of get asked to go on every committee that's going, and one thing leads to another and leads to another. And I'm sort of moving a little bit out of research now, and I'm more interested in the communication sides of things, one of the most fun things I've ever done was to be on the Climate Commission with Amanda, and then once that was abolished, to go on the Climate Council, and that's been an absolute joy. Stressful at times, but mostly a joy.
Thank you, Lesley. So Australia is one of the highest emitters of carbon on a per capita basis, and I'd like to look at how do we change behaviour around that. In any adapting and coping process, it involves sense making, making sense of the science, and also the affective and motivational component in terms of, if I've made sense of it, well, how do I feel about it, and what am I going to do about where I'm at? But there's so many conflicting messages around amidst all the fear. There's, we shouldn't be pursuing curbing our emissions. We shouldn't be embracing a low carbon future because that would mean it would cost jobs, it would cost too much money, and we're not going to be able to make a difference anyway because the world is full of bigger polluters than ours. And then there's the climate science, which is full of doom and gloom facts. So I'd like to ask you all, what's the best way to navigate around these various agendas and fears in order to enable sense making and also enable behaviour change in this whole space?
I'm jumping. I think for mine, I'm going to start, I'll set the scene and then I'll let my more learned colleagues jump in and fill in the details, but mine is about getting the transition right. So we look at the number of scientists that have put the case forward in the IPCC work. The science is there, and our position at Santos says leave the science to the scientists and they'll tell us what this issue is, and that's clear. So the call for action and for global action on climate change is there. So then what it is it's about on a economy by economy basis, or nation by nation, making sure that you can manage that transition to decarbonise the economy. And the rate of change in which you do that, the quickest way to do it is to collapse the economy. Now, nobody wants to do that. So then it's looking at what your competitive advantage is, what the structure of your economy is, and then how you make that transition. So, for example, what would work in New Zealand is very different to what would work in Australia because of where their sources of emissions are. They're very large in the agricultural and not so much in the fossil fuel or in the electricity sector or stationary energy sector. So for mine, it's about getting the policy signals right and putting them into the market and managing that transition. I work for Santos, we're a gas company. We're very positive around the role of gas in the transition to a low carbon economy and the role that natural gas can have with renewables. We see it and have the numbers to back up that it is a significantly lower carbon source. So for us, one of the biggest sources of emissions in Australia is the stationary energy sector. So it's about how do we decarbonise that part. But there's also transport, and also agriculture. They're the big, probably three wedges for us in Australia. So when we look at that transition, they're the areas that we need to look at. And we also need to be aware of both the demand side and the supply side. So there's things that we can all do. Australian houses, probably everyone in this room, but double glazing isn't standard. Let alone triple glazing and all those sorts of things. So there are a raft of things in the reg space there. But for me, my one point, it's about managing the transition.
Okay. So you've brought up that area about policy. I'm just, if we could focus just on the communication of the science and communicating through those messages that are very conflicting, I'm wondering what the rest of you think about the challenges. So Amanda, maybe you can talk about the demographic that the Climate Council targets and how do you effectively communicate the science to that demographic?
So our demographic is the Australian public. It's very broad. We try and connect with a lot of people in a lot of different ways. But I think it comes, for me, there's three aspects of this. Firstly, we need to understand the problem. And we do that primarily through communicating the science, through the media. But we focus on what is the impact. So what does it mean for real people's lives? And extreme weather is one example of that. So, for instance, we put out a range of reports on bushfires and climate change, for instance, illustrating ways in which bushfire weather is already become worse, or heat wave conditions, for instance. So and Lesley can probably talk in a little bit more detail about some of those reports. So clarifying for people, what does this actually mean? But this isn't about polar bears, this isn't about glaciers, this is about the average person. What does it mean for me? So it's also making it about the here and now rather than something that's happening in 10, 20, 50 years' time. I think although we like to think we care about our children's future, we care more about today. And I think as a society we need to be a bit honest about that. That's the way that we are behaving. So it's important to communicate the damage that we're doing already. So that's about understanding the problem. The second aspect of understanding the problem is then going to what do we need to do about it, what are the solutions? And it's reasonably basic. We know that the problem is caused by greenhouse gas emissions, and we know that the solution is reducing greenhouse gas emissions dramatically. And we know what causes greenhouse gas emissions, it's fossil fuels.
It's not just fossil fuels.
It's fossil fuels. In Australian context, the lion's share of our emissions come from electricity. So fossil fuels is a bit of a shorthand. There's obviously other ways that other emissions, whether it's from agriculture or other areas, deforestation's a big one too. But fossil fuels is sort of the lion's share of our emissions here in Australia. Coal particularly, we burn some very dirty coal, particularly in Victoria, and that is a big part of our emissions. So moving away from those fossil fuels to other alternative sources. Renewable energy in particular, we have a lot of sun in this country, we have a lot of wind, we have potential for other sources like geothermal wave that aren't as developed at this stage. And there's a lot of momentum both here and overseas. In 2006 we had a few hundred homes with solar panels. Now it's well over 1 million. So there's been a huge transition in renewable energy that's mirrored overseas as well. And we'd have a different perspective on gas, or certain sorts of gas, particularly fracking or shale, CSG, where we've got to be very careful about looking at fugitive emissions. So there's a methane that's escaping in a variety of ways from the process of CSG. And that's still in a process of being researched as to what exactly that looks like at this stage. And there's some indications that look like it might be okay, there's some indications that look like it could actually be worse than coal in terms of the amount of fugitive emissions. So we're pretty cautious about that area of energy transition.
Sorry, can I stop you there? So Amanda, in getting that information across, what's the best way to do that? Is it communicating the urgency around those issues? How effectively can you enable change in behaviour through? Because I appreciate that you understand the gamut of problems around those specific contexts, but in getting the message out there, what is the best way? Is it about diluting the science? And maybe Lesley can come into this conversation. How do you two both work together in the Climate Council? Because you have facts to communicate, but yet to get those facts across to society, is there a dilution that needs to take place for that then to be, for people to make sense of it?
Yeah, well I suppose we wouldn't be, I think I've just put out a bunch of different messages now, but we really focus on getting one thing across at a time. So we might, if we did a report on bushfires, we're getting a couple of core things across in that communication, whether it's in the media or whether it's on social media or other sort of digital components. So it's not necessarily making it simplistic. I think you can make things more simple without making them simplistic, and that's actually sort of the harder thing to do.
Amanda and I argue quite a lot about messages whenever we put out a report, so I'm the sort of the hard-nosed scientist saying, no, we can't say that, we have to qualify it in this way, and she's going, oh, but we need to, appeal to the average Joe Blow in the street, and so between us we go backwards and forwards and come up with something that we can both be satisfied with. So it's not, sometimes it's hard to come up with a scientific message that's true to the science but is palatable and easy to understand, and that's what we work very hard on with the Climate Commission and the Climate Council. But look, to come back to the original premise of your question, which is what is the best way forward, and I don't think there's a single best way forward. It's not just about behaviour. Behavioural change in the public is only part of it. part of it will be price signals, part of it will be international pressure, part of it will be the irresistible force of new technology and renewable energy getting cheaper and therefore becoming attractive. Partly it's people caring and being worried and being concerned about their own lives. And it's the whole package of that. You know, climate change is far too complex an issue to boil it down to simply a single message. So while in our reports we tend to focus on a few key messages at a time, we also recognise that there are multiple ways of getting to the problem, and no single way is exclusive.
Thank you. And Lesley, going on from what you were saying, when the science became mainstreamed, there wasn't much of an enthusiasm, given that scientists carry with themselves so much of credibility. Like when the Higgs boson particle was discovered, even though people didn't know what the God particle was, there was an excitement around it. But when climate science came onto the stage, people were in denial mode, but also they were doubting the science, and there was a centre of focus around that there's no consensus among scientists, or the models and the predictions that are wrong, or there's some issues around that. How difficult was that phase, and perhaps it's still going on, for you to work as a scientist in that phase? How difficult has that made your work, even through the IPCC?
In chemistry of the enhanced greenhouse effect for 190 years, so it's not new science, it's basic physics and chemistry, and a guy called Jean-Baptiste Fourier worked it out 190 years ago and wrote about it. So it came to public prominence probably in the late 80s, particularly with the work of Jim Hansen, who testified to the US Congress in 1988 and apparently was quoted afterwards to say, well, that's it. Everything will be fine now, they all understand, everybody will do the right thing, and of course we know that that didn't happen. Look, it's been a gradual process and it's been up and down. I think there is a huge misconception in the public as to both what the level of consensus is and to the level of denialism. So the level of scientific consensus is high 90s, 98, probably 99%. The level of hardcore denialism in the Australian public is about 8 to 10%, and that's it. And that's been very, very steady for a long time. There is a larger chunk of the population that think that the climate is changing, but they want to believe that it's natural variability. Look, as climate science communicators, we walk a really, really fine line. On the one hand, we have to get people to be concerned, otherwise what's the point? But we can't afford to scare people so much that they shut down. And I think denialism is a really natural human protective mechanism. If there's a scary thing that you can't cope with and you don't want to deal with, it's easier to deny it than to deal with it. And we walk the line all the time between those two things. That's the challenge.
Thank you. Laura, you work in the field of coastal management, and you're at the forefront of applying the science to the community. I'd like to ask you, given that you have to navigate through the community and their values, political jurisdictions, policymakers and their understanding of the science, and the complexity around managing the coast itself, how do you work around all of those issues, and how do you collaborate or consult to then come up with a coastal management policy that's sustainable?
Thanks. As we've heard from the other panellists, climate change is very, very complex, and the coastal zone is also incredibly complex. So when you bring those two together, you've really got what some people refer to as a wicked problem or a social mess, depending on how you look at it. So we've developed methodologies which are very specifically designed to examine climate science and other forms of climate knowledge in the context of the coastal zone. And we work with four main principles, which are a convening, which is bringing people together face to face, translating, which is translating information, whether it's scientific information, Indigenous knowledge, lay knowledge, or managerial knowledge, governance knowledge. We look at trying to translate those different types of knowledges and the different languages associated with them across the boundaries that exist between those types of sectors. We look at the importance of mediating conflict in a workshop situation, making sure that due processes seem to be done, and trying to resolve conflict in a calm and fair way. And then we look at collaborating to co-produce knowledge. Lesley's just been talking about scientific consensus, and that's an incredibly important concept, the importance of which I think is often overlooked in terms of the change that it's brought to our understanding of science, because we used to think of science as being something that's very positivist, something that's known by experts and can be applied, non-problematically. But now, with this notion of scientific consensus, we can see very clearly that there's actually a lot to do with the social construction of science, that the very notion of the word consensus tells us that there's no one person that has all the answers, but people have to come together to create a consensual or a negotiated understanding of what the truth actually is. And so we kind of expand on that notion in our workshops, and how we run them is that we use a technique, most commonly participatory mapping. So we get people in a workshop situation around Google Earth, with Google Earth open on each table, and physical maps there as well. And the first step is to get people to document the places that they cherish along the coast. So here we're actually not immediately trying to threaten people with climate change, but getting them to think about what it is they love on the coast and what it is they want to protect. And we look at social, cultural, economic and ecological values in 4 layers in Google Earth. And then we identify through the interaction of those layers what the hotspots are, where there's a lot of interaction between those layers, where there are synergies. And we call those our sustainability hotspots, and they become the focus for the rest of the workshop. We then bring in a series of speakers who we know to be very good communicators. They can be, typically we have somebody like a coastal engineer talking about sea level rise, or a CSIRO scientist talking about climate change and sea level rise. We'd have somebody from the governance sector talking about policy, our state coastal planning policy in Western Australia, and the governance context in which all this is happening, the local government context in which change is being made. We'd have an Indigenous person talking about the Indigenous experience of climate change, and certainly where we are in Western Australia, there is a cultural memory, and there are cultural stories that link, that go back to the time when our offshore islands were actually linked to Fremantle, when Rottnest Island was linked to Fremantle, and the Noongar people could actually walk out from Fremantle to Rottnest Island. So we get an Indigenous person to talk about their experience, their memories of that, their cultural memories of that, and what happened when sea level rose at the end of the last ice age and drowned the places that they used to live on. And so we get a variety of specialists to talk about the area, and then we go back to the mapping process, and we ask people to map it back into Google Earth, the concerns they have about their cherished areas in relation to the information on climate change that they've just heard. And so they map the concerns, and then the final stage is to discuss and to map what adaptive pathways they think would be appropriate for their cherished areas in terms of protecting them, or dealing with the advance of rising sea levels. So through those processes, we try to generate a collaborative approach to making sense of the impacts of climate change on the coast and what we should do about it, and to co-produce knowledge together through that workshop process. And we have scientists, we have policymakers, we have implementers, professionals and engineers, and we have the community all in the room together discussing it. And we find that process creates a sense of ownership and of the adaptive planning experience.
In the business scenario, what kind of unique nuances do you use to communicate why solar is an advantage in a residential context or a commercial context or an industry context?
Well, I know I'm giving a very different perspective here because we talk to homeowners and businesses every day, and the reality is that if we tried to sell solar just because it was good for the environment and would decrease climate change, we would be out of business. For probably 80% of the people that we talk to and the people who buy solar in our industry, they are looking to save money, and that is the way that we manage to get it through, which is unfortunate, but it's just what we see. There's a real, I guess you could almost say apathy with your everyday homeowners and also business people. They're more interested in the bottom line and how they can cut down on their electricity costs. Now, we see the advantage of something like solar to help people reduce their carbon footprint, basically. And that's what we believe in, that's why we started the company, that's all of our team have that ethos behind them. But for us, we push this will save you money. And that's why things like government incentives have been so important for the solar industry in particular, and wind as well, to help us get onto our feet, because it is such an important thing, but it's very hard to get that education and that awareness out without some sort of monetary incentive for those people, for those businesses, and for the businesses and the homeowners. So it's unfortunate, but at least we're doing it, at least we're getting it out there.
And I think you're right. I think economic instruments really do shape behaviour. I think with the carbon tax gone now, we are left with direct action. And a crucial component of direct action is the Environment Reduction Fund. And Greg Hunt has been quoted to say that involves practical actions such as cleaning up waste, coal mine gas, cleaning up waste landfill gas, cleaning up methane. I'm wondering, Heather, if you could perhaps talk about direct action policy in terms of how effective could such a policy be, and do you think that this legislation needs to include penalties for big polluters and who breach baseline emissions?
Absolutely. I think there's no point paying a whole bunch of people to reduce emissions while someone else increases emissions, because you won't end up with the emissions reduction that you need. In an ideal world, I think we would have a little bit of carbon pricing or carbon taxes and direct action or direct money into emissions reductions. Having sat in the policy space and watched the debate go from carbon taxes, when Denmark brought in their carbon taxes in the 90s, everyone was very keen that should be the sort of way forward. And then we started talking about the language of a market-based instrument, and even though it was great to see carbon pricing, I've been in energy efficiency policy for a long time, and cranking up the price of energy by a little way was never going to change some of the basic emission reductions opportunities in energy efficiency. It wasn't going to change the equation for people, and there's been a long debate in policy between economists and engineers about me saying we can change these lights and save energy in a cost-effective way, and the economists saying, well, if you can do that, I don't believe you, because people would be doing it already. And the fact is that there's a whole lot of market failures around that sort of thing, and the carbon price wouldn't solve that sort of thing. In fact, we've had massive price rises in energy, and we have seen that drive some response in the market, but the massive price rise hasn't been due to the carbon price. It's been other elements in the electricity market. But certainly in South Australia we saw a couple of upticks in solar uptake when electricity prices rose. So one of the exciting things about direct action, if you want to get excited about direct action, is that it promises to push money into projects. And I am hopeful that they will structure the direct action and emissions reduction fund mechanisms so that some of that money can go to energy efficiency projects and be used to overcome some of the market failures. In an ideal world, I would like a carbon price and a direct action policy, please.
What are your thoughts, everyone else on the panel, about direct action or any other carbon pricing mechanisms?
I'll just add something.
Yes.
I really agree with what Heather's been saying about the need for a combination, and I think Lesley made the point earlier about a combination of motivators. And direct action is going to work if you've got, it's a major undertaking, not something that's a bit half-baked and half-hearted. But I think something Heather said earlier is important, which is about getting the policy settings right. And the problem at the moment is that people aren't rewarded for doing the right thing. They're not rewarded economically, they're not rewarded by any means for doing the right thing in terms of reducing carbon emissions. Behaviour change is less likely to occur if there aren't the proper incentives in place, and you're asking people to, push it uphill, do things that are expensive or inconvenient or a big effort, and people are not so likely to do that. But one possibility, and this is a very high level type of change I'm talking about now, but to develop a different tax structure system where instead of having a tax system based on primary, secondary and tertiary sources, which we do at the moment, why not have a tax system which rewards people for doing things sustainably? So if you've got a sustainable company, if you're a solar energy company, or if you're in the transition business, you get a lower tax rate than if you're a company that is purely extracting coal or purely extracting minerals from the ground and have no regenerative or sustainable dimension to what you're doing. So to me, we need a tax system that right from the get-go rewards sustainable businesses for doing the right thing. And obviously that's going to be a big change, but it's fair to say that the current tax system and accounting system that we've got, it's not God-given. It was only developed in the 1930s, and it was developed as a means to justify expenditure in the Second World War. So, and other countries, not all countries in the world, have the same tax and accounting system that we currently have. So it's possible to change it if we are prepared to think differently.
An anecdote from the UK is that they had faster write-down on energy-efficient equipment, and not so much about the financial benefit that sold, but it sent a signal to accountants everywhere, and they were ringing the energy management division to say, how do we get some?
Exactly.
As opposed to this whole...
Again, when you're looking at businesses, and I'm looking at SMEs at the moment, rather than very large corporate, because SMEs are very important and they do use a lot of energy as well, but they are all doing it tough. They're all very busy. You ask them to do something else, there's got to be an advantage. So I completely agree with what everyone else is saying.
And just going from that, Jenny, so the policy that has worked is the RET, the renewable energy tax target, and yet we have so much of uncertainty around this particular policy. It's quite a progressive policy which has been rolled back, but I'm hearing now that they're not going to abolish it, that the target might change. How will that affect Suntrix?
Look, if they talk about a real 20%, in our mind, from our industry, the real 20% is going to decimate the solar industry as much as if they abolished it. It would be very little difference. And it confuses me.
Why
is
that? Just to explain, I'm just curious or something. Because it was, 41,000 gigawatts is the target, and that will go to about 26-27%.
Yes.
So we take
it shows the difference in regards to the industry number of jobs.
Is that because there's a lot of permits now from the residential PV? Because I'm just curious as to because it's terrible that it would decimate the industry, but why such a relatively small change to bring it back to what the original policy intent was would collapse the industry? And the only thing I can think of is there an oversupply of permits from the, what was it, 5 at 1? Yeah,
the multiplier? No, I don't think it has anything to do with the multiplier.
Yeah.
When you, again, this goes back to incentives and encouraging companies to do the right things and take up solar, and when you're looking at the real 20%, the value of a system is not going to be much different to if you abolished it completely. And I will pull out this lovely little PowerPoint that I've got, and as I said, I just can't pull out the figures in front of my head. I know people who can, but I can't do that. But even the report that was put out, there are comments in there saying that electricity prices will increase if you abolish the RET. So it does confuse me why they're still looking at that as an option. And the way I see it, everyone's waiting with bated breath, and it has completely stalled the industry. Not only from our point of view as a business and the other people who run solar and wind especially. I mean, it's going to have a huge impact on wind as well. No one's growing, no one's pushing forward, there's a lot of hesitation, hardly anyone's hiring, it's very difficult in that sense. But we actually find it from the customer perspective as well. They're all waiting to see what happens. They don't want to get caught. They're worried that they'll commit to something and then the incentives get taken away.
Where is the market going? But I am remaining hopeful that the market will go somewhere. And it's not only the changes around policy changes, it's around technology changes too. So we've got this overlay of changes, and the first people out of the blocks to explain that to businesses or explain that to customers have the best, they spearhead into the market, don't they? So there's a lot of interesting times.
Yeah.
And I can always go back to writing policy about the changes if no one pays me then.
Thanks, Heather. Susie, I'd like to you mentioned that you have brought about a change to Santos in terms of making it part of the solution, even though it is an oil and gas company. Can you enlighten us as to the difficulties around walking a really fine line between ensuring that Santos works within the legislative boundaries?
Yes.
And then you've also got
That's not actually a fine line, that's a pretty thick one.
And the unrest around coal seam gas.
Yeah, well, I'm sure we could talk on that tonight, couldn't we? It was interesting, I think, Lesley, you mentioned about the conflict you both have in terms of you've got to have it right and all the caveats and so forth. That's what we have to do as well. And so a lot of our critics can make a comment that we believe is wrong, and then we have to explain it with a whole lot of data, and we don't get across these nice crisp sound bites. So back to your question. From the gas company, the first one was what changes have we put in place and how do we do it, and then what's the challenge now and why is the coal seam gas perceived to be, and what are the challenges around future emissions there. So the first one put in place is you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And to be honest, back in 2003-04, it was really about making sure that we had the engineers were capturing those emissions, and what we did is we embedded into our product accounting system carbon dioxide equivalents as just another product, and we put a value to that product. We just happened to have a negative value as opposed to our other products. And so that way we could measure it. But the other thing that's really easy in terms of how do you sell it and to whom is, for us, it's in our best interest to make sure that we capture every single molecule of gas, because everything that we burn or flare or is lost as a fugitive is basically like losing merchandise off your shelf. So we have a vested interest, and it was about making sure that I got into the right engineering teams and out of the environment group and into the product accounting guys and into the operations guys and looking at projects there. And so then we can sell that both from it's the right thing to do. It can reduce our potential future liability as it was then, but it's also revenue we can put back in the pie. And so our energy efficiency projects that we've put in place over that time are now delivering a saving of nearly 5 petajoules, so 4.8 PJs, but into CO2, that's around 250,000 tonnes of CO2, and our total emissions are 3.5 million. So they're big numbers, but it's a fair chunk of savings that we've been able to deliver through our energy efficiency programs, and that's something that I'm very, proud to have contributed to. And criticism of this. I was fortunate enough to go to an IPCC meeting on fugitive emissions, and there was mostly academics. There were a few consultants and a few industry people there, and a large swag of government people, of course. And the thing that shocked me was how much more stringent the Australian reporting rules are in the oil and gas sector. I can't comment for any other sector, that's my error, than they are in other places. So we keep hearing this press, and I'll get a note from our CEO or from Vice President saying, what's this new factor in the States? They've changed the emissions factor for shale gas. It's 4 times higher than it was. What are you doing about it? And I'd be shocked. And so we've spent a lot of time in this space, and they report differently to us. We report on the volume of product through a pipeline, and at every emissions source we're measuring that, whether we're measuring it by flow rate, temperature, pressure, or meters, and all those sorts of things. In America, it's by pieces of equipment, and they number of pieces of equipment, and then by runtime, and they calculate it. So it's not really comparing apples and apples. They're slightly different. So I was getting frustrated with this because I kept getting this thrown back at us. Their number's different to yours. You must be reporting it wrong. So what I did is I took one of our facilities, and much to the disappointment of a member of my team, I said, right, you have to redo the calculation using the American methodology, the US EPA methodology. And put them, so basically meant they had to do the same job twice, which they love doing. And came up with numbers pretty much the same. Wasn't materially different. Then what we've done is we've worked collaboratively with CSIRO. They've come out and done substantive testings at our wellheads, which is where people were concerned about the leaks. And that report came out that the number that we're using in our NGERS reporting, which is the National Greenhouse and Energy Reporting Act, the fugitive factor that we have to apply there was appropriate. So they had that the number that we were applying was appropriately capturing those emissions. To put it in scale, most of our emissions are coming from burning fuel to run our compressors, so run the engines that push the gas through the pipe, or separating out CO2 from what we call the reservoir gas. In the coal seam gas fields, our reservoir gas CO2 is less than 1%, a very, very small amount. What the concern was there was methane escaping up through the wells. They found 0 escaping through the well casing, which is the cement around the well. They measured the emissions at the well heads and at the leak points, and that was in line with the emissions that we were reporting. When this report was studied, one of the things the industry said is, you need to test more wells than this number. And they said, yes, we do, but this is what we're going to do, because we're going to do it quickly, but we're going to go back, and by quickly, 12 months. We're going to go back and do some more. So we support that testing, and I'm very confident that they'll find that the numbers are appropriate, because if we've got methane leaking around our well sites, that's a safety issue. And that's something that we have gas detectors on site. So the numbers we are capturing are appropriate. The fugitive emissions, so those losses from those minor leaks, for Santos, from memory, and it is in our sustainability report, are around 13,000 tonnes, about 3.5 million tonnes. So it's mostly the fuel use and the other processes that we do at the plant where our emissions come from. And I'm happy to take any questions on that later.
So,
I know, sorry for getting a bit tech out there, but I'm getting a bit fired up.
would you be saying that the community doesn't understand then? They don't get the real picture about what's happening around coal seam gas, that there are misperceptions and myths around what they believe in?
Well, I was really interested in the communications question. I think that's bang on. I don't think we're particularly good at communicating it. And me, in the sustainability hat on and the carbon, I've got to take some of the blame, probably a fair chunk of the blame of that at Santos. So I think there is a misunderstanding of what the compliance obligations are and how the industry works. But I don't think that's, we need to be better at communicating that. And even one of the things I found that we have to do is we've engaged, even when Cyro came out, to actually have step through the process first, so that then they can identify where they need to set up their sampling, and so they'll put a case over a wellhead and they measure everything within it, and they in fact create a vacuum, so they're sucking the gas out to work out what those those tests are. So, yeah, and even now, look at me waffling on. You're terrible at communicating.
So, Susie, do you think Santos is more likely to move more towards gas production and move away from the fossil burning oil, because gas is lesser in carbon emissions? Do you think that's going to happen in the future?
One of the things that we do in our sustainability disclosures, and there's a whole lot of environment, social governance and so forth, is they do a criteria on if your production is more than 80% gas, and ours is significantly more than 80% gas. So from our point of view, that's what our portfolio looks like for the next 20 odd years, and both in the conventional gas and coal seam gas. And the other thing on the coal seam gas is we have a field, it's called Scotia in Queensland. We've been operating coal seam gas there for about 20 years. So one thing that caught the industry a bit, or caught me perhaps flat-footed, was that wasn't very well known or understood either, that we have been operating in coal seam gas for a long time. And the same with fracking. We have been fracking for a long time, and it's basically, I can explain that process in as much detail as you want, but we've been doing that to get more, when the wells aren't flowing, basically to get when the rock's not very porous or it's not flowing or whatever. But at the moment, in our Queensland wells, it's only about 5% fracked.
Lesley,
can I make a comment?
yes, sorry, go on, Amanda.
We have it's probably worth, probably not everyone in the audience is familiar with fugitive emissions. Methane, as you may or may not know, you probably know it from the gas on your stove. That's less polluting than coal, for instance, substantially. But on the flip side, methane, in contrast to CO2 gas, is about 21 times more potent as a greenhouse gas. So that's why we're concerned about fugitive emissions, is because it's more substantive as a greenhouse gas, and you probably have seen in the news stories about the permafrost melting and methane coming out of the permafrost. That's why that's so worrying, is because methane is stronger as a greenhouse gas. Fugitive emissions have been one of the faster growing greenhouse gases in Australia. They're now about the same proportion as transport, which makes it a pretty significant chunk and something that we need to think about. So we've been having a look at what the research is out there, and so there is a contrast then between conventional gas and CSG, or shale gas, or non-conventional gas, and there is concerns about what the fugitive emissions look like. Some of the shale gas in the US, which isn't what Susie's been talking about in the Australian context, has emissions of about 4% of the methane coming out of some of those shale gas extractions, which makes it almost as polluting as a coal-fired generator. So that's why our sort of antenna went up to that issue. So I think that one thing the industry probably does is overplay the research, which is probably, understandably, there's a vested interest in producing more of the gas. When there's positive research comes out, everyone jumps on it and says, and I saw the SIRA research, but it's fair to say that that's pretty preliminary research. It's looking at 1% of the gas wells around Australia, and we'd say there's a lot more to be done. And I think that that's, in terms of the research, we need to be very cautious, I think, when we're putting in a lot of new infrastructure and touting it as something that's a solution to move away from coal, to make sure that we're not making the same mistakes again. We need to make sure that we've got a short period of time to bring in solutions to the climate crisis, to make sure that we meet the emission reduction targets we need to. So we need to make sure the solutions are right, and we don't end up investing in false solutions, thinking that we're doing the right thing, and unfortunately then we've got a whole lot of fugitive emissions at the same time. So our caution is always, let's make sure we've done the research and we know what we're up against here.
Just on the research, absolutely. Support peer-reviewed, robust science, and there's not a lot. I can quote 2 reports, the India Texas report and the SIRA report. All of the others haven't gone through that process or have been severely critiqued. And so whatever you're reading, read widely, because you can, it's a bit like statistics, you can take whatever report out you want to prove whatever point you want. and there's not a lot of middle ground. So you make a point that industry will pick and quote the reports that suit their purposes, and so will the detractors. And I think everyone should do their own analysis and read widely, because and also check the reference sources to which they're going back to. We did an interesting mapping exercise, and everyone kept going back to this one report that had error and a starter in it. Right. So, and the other just point of is the fugitive emissions that are growing isn't just the methane. So when Australia's reporting fugitive emissions, they mean all emissions from coal and natural gas. So that's all of the emissions except for our fuel use. So that's from coal mines, from reservoir CO2, and from methane.
Yeah, that's a good point to make. Susie, do you see yourself becoming perhaps an independent authority later on when you move away from Santos and you're able to monitor the research around us? That would be great. Yeah. Because we need someone like you to be doing that, who can pick through all those details.
Yeah, sometimes when you've been minding carbon policy for a while, I dream of being a baker or something.
Thank you. Lesley, I'd like to ask you to share with us what's it like working in the IPCC. The last report, I understand, took 6 years in the making with over 800 scientists around the world. What does it feel like, and what are some of the challenges around it?
Well, they all take about 6 years. They come out every 7 years, and as soon as they come out, the next one starts getting planned. I got into the IPCC, and it's important to note that the authors are not members of the IPCC, the countries are. It's about 200 countries around the world. I originally put up my hand. The IPCC calls for volunteers, sort of nominations, and then you go through a selection process at your country stage, and those names get forwarded to the IPCC Secretariat. And I originally put up my hand to be a contributing author, which is just a sort of writing a little tiny bit, because they didn't have somebody for the Australia chapter. It comes back to what I was talking before. You sort of get lucky when there's not very many other people in the space. They needed an ecologist to do the biodiversity section, so they asked me to be a lead author. And I enjoyed it so much for the 4th assessment report that I put up my hand to do it for the 5th.
Did you put a little section in on the impact on ants?
No, ants are not mentioned in anything that I've written. There's very little research on climate change and ants.
Humans might not, but the ants will be there.
One of the most frustrating things about being an author is that, for example, if I give you the example from the last chapter that I worked on, which was the Australia and New Zealand Australasian chapter in the 5th assessment report, I was in charge of terrestrial, freshwater and marine biodiversity, and I had to I sent the marine stuff off to somebody else to write, but for terrestrial and freshwater I had to cover observed impacts, predicted impacts and adaptation for New Zealand and Australia, terrestrial and freshwater, in a page and a half. And 7 years worth of research. So the most frustrating thing is, even though the reports are 800 pages long, you've got incredible space pressure, so you really, every single word counts. It's an amazing process. It's like no other process scientifically or academically in the world, because I wish I could remember the numbers. Our chapter, which was one of the least contentious chapters, probably had several thousand comments on each draft, usually about 2,000 comments on each draft. Every single comment has to be responded to in writing, and you can disagree, but you have to respond, and all of that is public. So anybody can go and see any comment that anybody has made and see how the author team responded to it. So there is an enormous pressure on that transparency and rigorous aspect. So it's a roller coaster ride. You go for whole months, several months with nothing to do, and then the draft will be needed to be, come back from review, and you'll need to work on it, and then you devote the next few weeks or months almost solely to it. So you do need to have a flexible job, like an academic job, because otherwise you just can't cope with it. But I feel enormously privileged to have been part of the IPCC process. I will never forget my very first meeting was in Vienna at the UN building, and we sat in that UN, huge, great amphitheatre with these little microphones and the translators up in the top glass thing. and there were about 300 people in the room from all over the world, and it was just I just sort of thought, if I just keep my mouth shut, they won't realise that I shouldn't really be here. But it was enormously exciting, and it's been a huge privilege. And I think the main really fun thing has been it allows you to be part of something that's much, much bigger than yourself. You know, this is a truly international effort. Nobody gets paid to do it. Everybody, you know, you get funded by your country to cover your expenses, but nobody gets paid. And you look around the room at hundreds of people in all sorts of colours and costumes and all of that sort of thing, and you're united in this cause, and it's very, very exciting.
I was really interested to hear that you volunteered at the very start and then re-volunteered. That's quite a big issue around women in leadership, that they tend to hold back and not put themselves forward. I'm wondering, from all of your experiences, do you find that there is gender equality in terms of representation at this elite level? Are there equal numbers of women and men?
Well, if we come back to the IPCC, it's about 10% of the lead authors are women. That was for both the two last assessment reports. So there were 3 women out of 8 on our chapter in the 5th, but I was the only woman in the 4th one in our chapter out of 8 lead authors. So certainly not gender equality. It's not that people get discriminated against. In fact, the technical support unit bends over backwards to, well, they don't just have the gender issue, they have the developed versus developing country issue, social science versus physical science versus health science versus everything else issue. It's a huge juggling task to choose the author teams. Very, very difficult. I don't envy them that at all. But yeah, it's about 10% of women.
I come from oil and gas company, so no, our numbers, our gender numbers are in the sustainability report. It's a cracking read. Recommend it to you all. But it's something that our company does take very seriously, and so the graduates now that come through our program every year, those numbers are equal. And so it'll be a generational change as it goes through, and the rest of the process. So we have a very good process in place to address that, and leadership programs for women. But it is about, as a woman in this space, is I don't know, perhaps saying yes and working out how you'll do it afterwards, or putting yourself forward, and knowing that there's a support network around that you can rely on, and go to, and then that if there is an opportunity to present yourself, you can get after it. But having said, I work in the oil and gas industry, and it's not there yet, but it's changing. Whenever I go to meetings on climate change, that's where it is fairly gender neutral, and I find that interesting. And is that it seems to have, even when you're sitting around an industry table talking about climate change and climate change policy, that it is about 50-50 in the room. And I can't tell you why, but whether there's a passion, whether it was opportunistic or.
Yeah, I'd back that up actually. Certainly at Curtin University, there's a very strong female leadership at the very senior executive level. The last 2 vice chancellors have been women, and a number of the DVCs and PVCs underneath them are women, and that's very strongly promoted at Curtin. And also in the sustainability area, in our policy unit, well, the directors are male, but almost all the other staff are women. I think there's one other male out of about 10 or 12 staff. We're mostly women, and I would say the majority of our students in the sustainability and climate change policy masters that I coordinate and teach in are also women. So that there's definitely strong leadership from women in the sustainability and climate change area.
I work in a very male-dominated industry, I have to say, as a business owner in renewable energy, and also as an entrepreneur in the business groups that I'm in. I am always generally one of the few. And you know what, it's never really, well, you definitely see a disadvantage. I've never thought, I've never wanted to be a bloke, if that makes sense. I'm quite happy being who I am. And I've, you know, I have a concern about considering us a minority, but the reality is that I need to go and I need to prove myself because I am a young, short female with curly hair, and it's very hard to be taken seriously when you go in to meet a bunch of blokes, and we were talking about this last week. You know, a bloke can walk into a corporate meeting, sit down, say something, or even just from face value, and people expect that he knows what he's talking about and he understands you know, his products and his services, whereas for me I need to spend the first 5 minutes proving myself and validating myself and showing that I know those things before they actually go, oh okay, yeah, she does know her shit, okay, not a problem. And having come from I was a librarian, so having come from a very female dominated industry where all of my managers and their managers and everything, they were all female and lovely, very strong women, it was when I first started in this space, it was a bit of a reality check to not be taken seriously at, you know, at face value and have to prove myself. I think I was quite sheltered and, you know, I had it quite easy in that library industry. So it was a bit of a culture shock to start with. Now I just barge in and do it, so it's okay.
I just had a flashback hearing you saying that because when I was on the Renewable Energy Advisory Council in the very early 1990s in WA, there was myself and then there was one other woman out of 12, so there were 2 out of 12 women. And Dorothy Verma, my colleague, was an engineer, an energy engineer, and she had a baby while she was on the Renewable Energy Advisory Council. And the first day she brought the baby along to the meeting and breastfed it at the table. The guys' eyes were just but they didn't say anything, they got over it, and she used to do it at every meeting. So that was good.
Good on it.
Yeah, just good on it.
Well, sorry.
I was just going to say, my experience reflects what others have said, and now that we're a not-for-profit as opposed to government, it's similar in the not-for-profit space. Most of the people doing the work are women, and the people at the highest executive level tend to be men. So in the not-for-profit space, it seems to me to be roughly 80% of people are women and 20% are men. So that's, I continue to find that surprising. There's been a bit of a shift. The head of the ACF this year, Australian Conservation Foundation's Kelly O'Shaughnessy. I think she's one of the first women in one of the big environment not-for-profits to take on a role like that. But similarly, my experience in science or in government in this is that the most senior positions are generally held by men, but a lot of the not as senior positions are held by women, and there's a huge amount of great expertise that are held by women, but it's disappointing that women aren't in the more senior positions in this area, I think.
Do you see a change coming through?
Maybe this is too pessimistic, but I don't think so. Like, I'm 30 and most of my friends are thinking about having babies. And I read that book Lean In not that long ago, and she's got this bit about how you take your foot off this accelerator when you start thinking about having children in your career, and she advises you should put the accelerator on right until you're having a baby, and then she went back to work 3 weeks later or something. Like, was a bit over the top, but it might be. But I think watching my friends, they're all taking their foot off the accelerator. They've all been career women, and they've been really determined to put their career first, and now they're taking their foot off the accelerator, which, you know, is what they feel like they want to do and they need to do, but generally their husbands still have their foot on the accelerator. So I just think we have a structural problem, and we probably won't change it unless we're changing the way we do childcare and the whole range of other things.
I think you're bang on with that. It's about shifting the paradigm and how we work, and that creating those flexible workplaces. And they're not new, we've had them, but they just hasn't had that mass change, that mass paradigm change. You know, if you, it could be as simple as working hours or job sharing or those sorts of things.
And just breaking the stereotypes around women and valuing women's contribution rather than having for them to prove that whatever they say, it needs backing up.
And it being about men changing the way they work as well. Like, I think it can't just be women changing the way we work. I think it's got to be expected that there's a genuine equality in the household responsibilities, and obviously that's different over time in people's lives, and there might be different priorities at different times, and one person's career might reform whatever, but I just think we're not, we sort of think we've come a long way, but I think there's a really long way to go.
Yeah, we tend to undervalue people who are only prepared to contribute to the workforce part-time, you know, and instantly that's a lesser value. Why should that be?
I was going to ask this, it's a question Heather to ask of you, is can a part-time person, like 3 days a week, be a team leader?
Yes, I think so, and I think the world of flexible working has heralded in much different. I've always argued that it's no different from my busy boss who you never saw because they were in meetings all the time. You know, okay, half my meetings were with my children, and I was available to my staff. But the barrier is convincing others, and I've just left the public service, and one of the reasons was that. I believe my manager wanted someone who she saw more often, and my part-timeness really undermined my ability to be that visible person for her. And so, you know, and she was a woman, so there's no easy answers. I think it's a real cultural thing.
I think it's tough though because I love my kids. Like I've got a 3 and a 5-year-old, and I'm all torn every day because I love my job and I've got a high responsibility job, and it's hard for I wouldn't be able to do what I was doing part-time. I'm working there, but give us another year or two. But every day I want to spend time with my children. So it's not even the fact that I can put them in childcare, and I've got a very supportive husband as well. But me personally, I want to do both things, and then you have all of your guilt things. You know, I'm not a good mother and I'm not a good boss because I'm trying to balance both and not doing either properly. So there's a lot of challenges in that way. So it's not even other people's perception and can you shift your working conditions. It has to do with me and the fact that I love being a mum and I love my kids, but I also love what I do for a living. So it's tough.
My stepdaughter's been 6 and she's got 2 children under 4, and she works 2.5 days a week, and I think she manages it really fantastically. She's in a very senior position. She's a chief advisor to a minister, and she's in a job share situation with a guy, and they manage a team of people between them. And the office is incredibly supportive about her being part-time and having family, and they really respect her boundaries. They don't bother her when she's at home being a mum. They don't ask her to come in on days when they know she's supposed to be being a mum, and it's working really well. So it can work well with an appropriately supportive environment.
And an environment where there's trust.
Where there's trust,
yes.
And good communication.
Yes.
And an objective-based environment as opposed to presenteeism.
Yeah.
Just because to Heather's point, just there it does not be very productive. But if this is what we're doing as a team, this is how we're going to get there, and then letting individuals use their own style to get there. That's right.
I agree. Yeah. Perhaps we can end our discussion on perhaps a one-liner from each of you as to where do you see yourself in 5 years' time?
I'm going to be a maker.
How about you?
Well, I've just taken on a new role at my university of a half-time Pro Vice-Chancellor research role. I'm still full-time working, probably about 250% at the moment, I think. So I see myself continuing in that I've moved away from personal research, not completely, but almost, towards a facilitating research role, which I find actually now more satisfying. But I hope 5 years' time, where will we be, Amanda? It will be 2019. On the Climate Council, when we got together for our first meeting after we formed, we, at Tim Flannery's suggestion, decided that we would give ourselves a sunset clause of 2020, because the critical decade has been our mantra, and that's up in 2020, and we figure that that's our end date. So I guess in 5 years' time we'll be evaluating whether it's all worked and whether we need to start planning in the organisation.
Thank you.
That was more than I'd like to say.
Look, I would like to be involved. I see the role of creativity, art, poetry, writing, as being incredibly powerful tools of communication, especially in terms of translating science into ways that ordinary human beings, not just super scientists, can understand. And some of the work that we did in the Coastal Collaboration Cluster did look at art as a way of representing climate change, and poetry as a way of representing environmental impacts. And the feedback that we had from those was incredible. People loved it, and they wrote in their exit surveys very profusely supportive comments about the role of creativity in supporting science communication. So that's an area that I would like to explore a lot more, both with my own writing and with facilitating other creative engagement with climate science.
On those really tough days, you know, when you're dealing with millions of dollars worth of stock and everything else, I've always said to my husband, we should have just opened up a donut shop. I would have been fatter but happier. But you know, well, we've got a 3 to 5 year plan for Suntrix, and that's seeing us nationally and a monitoring system internationally as well, which we've already started this year. But regardless, I see it being in some sort of renewable energy. It's in your blood. It's important to me. It's not, for me, it's not a job, it's a passion. So although I love the donut idea as well, I think it is definitely going to be in renewable energy.
Thanks, Jenny.
I'm an optimist, so I am looking at a whole lot of interesting potential changes, and I'm excited about smart grids, I'm excited about microgrids, I'm excited about community energy, and in 5 years' time I hope I can look back on 5 years worth of stimulating good projects, getting things started, talking a lot about these things that I'm excited with, and hopefully having more people understand me when I talk to them about this stuff.
I think you're right, it's very important to be optimistic and look at things as opportunities. And so I think we've had a lot of success with our energy efficiency program. I like the idea of looking at integration. So for example, we've integrated PV at our well sites, and so instead of using gas or diesel at the well sites, we're using photovoltaics to run our well site telemetry and those sorts of things. So I like the idea of integrating technology, so it's not just a fossil fuel hub or a natural gas hub that we can integrate, whether it be solar thermal to replace our steam boilers, all those sorts of things. 5 years might be a bit of a short time frame because you wouldn't even be able to build it and be able to get the approvals in that time, but integrating further that energy efficiency and creating this sort of cleaner energy hubs is where I'd like to drive the Santos agenda.
I have 2 5-year visions for the Climate Council. The first is that we would have helped to fundamentally shift the public conversation on climate change. So whichever political party is in power, whether it's state or federal level, that they fundamentally have to deal with this problem to the level that the science demands. The second aim, if we've probably achieved that one, is I'd like to see us having a global role. I think that the communication challenges that we've been discussing exist not just here but all across the world. And I was at a forum recently where there were leaders from South Korea, China, India, Nepal. They all, and I did a presentation on climate comms, and they all said that's exactly the problem that we're having. We can't make this issue resonate with the average person. We can't work out how to communicate the science and the complex policy and the economics and make it interesting. So I hope that we become a global climate communications hub, and we can assist others around the world to communicate more effectively.
Thank you. Would you like to please thank our panel for this wonderful... Have 2 microphones on either side of the room, and I'd love you to come up and perhaps make comments or share your thoughts or ask questions of our panel. If you are going there, there is a switch on the microphone that you just need to turn on.
I'm forming a queue.
Yes, please.
Actually, you can come up on the stage at that place.
Actually, I would like to introduce Judith Brett. Judith is from the Victorian Women's Trust, and she's going to talk to us about the Monster Climate Petition.
sorry, I've got to turn it
So
on.
I've
My background's in politics. I've recently retired as a politics academic, so I've also got a sort of comment that I've a question for everybody, and I've got a spruik. And the question is really, I'd be interested in the panel's sense of where we are in terms of the politics of climate change at the moment, because beginning of this year, having taught politics for 20 years and taught about social movement politics, being retired, I felt I could actually start to get involved in it. And with some other women at the Victorian Women's Trust, we've got this petition going, which I'm going to circulate for you all to sign. So while, and it's basically, it's to the House of Representatives, and the pen's gone off, and it's asking for two things. One is it's asking for immediate action on carbon emissions reduction, and it's also asking for some leadership on this issue at global forums. Now, petitions, it's addressed to the Parliament, not to the government. So it's a bipartisan petition, basically because we've got to get some bipartisan cooperation going. But the other thing about petitions to the House of Representatives, which all of us who signed the Get Up petitions probably don't realise, is that they have to be pen and ink signatures. The House of Representatives doesn't take electronic petitions. But it does mean that unlike the electronic petitions, they actually get tabled in Parliament and they get sent to the Minister, and there's some request for a response, there's some expectation of a response. The other thing I'd say is that historically mass petitions have marked shifts in political morality. If you think of the anti-slavery petitions, the mass charters petitions, which were really for democratic rights, and then the suffragette petitions. And we've called this the Monster Climate Petition after the Monster Suffragette Petition in Victoria in 1891, where women pasted all the petitions onto this huge roll of cloth, which was wound up and went into Parliament. So it's two things I was hoping people would sign, but also at the back there's sheets you could take away and you could go and collect some signatures. People could collect 10 signatures, well then I double the impact of my talk. But the other thing is I'd be interested in the panel's sense of where Australian climate politics is at the moment, and how we're going to get out of this rather sort of toxic space. This is my view as a political scientist, that it's become so polarised, and even in the run-up to the G20 we seem to still be in this polarised space. So, like most of you are coming from more sort of technical backgrounds, but what your sense is of how we can shift to a more bipartisan and civilised conversation on this.
I guess I'll be blunt. I don't think we will while we have the current Prime Minister, is my view. I think this is a temporary blip in climate change politics in Australia. I really don't think we will move beyond that in the current situation, so it will take either one or multiple elections.
I see the political change not as a one slow journey, but as this sort of oscillation that we see with any policy issue. And the classic policy example is always smoking, how the debate goes back and forth a long time before you get over the line and get mainstream consensus. So I see the current step back as picking up a whole heap of the population that need to come on the journey. In a sense, the very fact that we had to step back was there's enough of our population back there that need to come on the journey, and it's just an indicator of where we are. I'm quite optimistic that Tony Abbott is mostly talking to the Australian population, but formally some of the policies haven't been unravelled as much as he'd like. That even though he's making quite bold statements and he's way over here, there's still a nice team of bureaucrats. I'm an ex-bureaucrat sitting there trying to keep this lot moving forward.
Can I say to what I just said? I mean, I don't result from what I just said, but however, It's not just about politics. I mean, I think we get hung up on temporary politics. What really matters is the atmosphere. The atmosphere doesn't care about politics, it doesn't care about policy, it just cares about how much CO2 is in there. And really what we've got to do is change the atmosphere. And it doesn't matter how we get there, and it doesn't matter who's in power. I think we get distracted from the main game, which is the atmosphere, by getting hung up on politics. And it's what people do that counts, not what they think. So we could have 22 million people sitting around on their couch being really, really concerned about climate change but doing nothing, and that won't matter a jot to the atmosphere. Or we could have a whole bunch of skeptics that for whatever other reason, economic reasons, are actually reducing carbon emissions, and that's what counts. So in one sense,
because they don't want to miss out because they don't.
Exactly, it comes back to what Jenny said before. You know, so let's not get distracted by temporary politics. Let's work on the main game, which is carbon in the atmosphere.
If I could add to that, I think there's a few things to be excited about in the current dynamic. I think that it's important to look where the money's going in any sort of issue, and I think that there's obviously this week or last week, ANU announced that they were divesting part of their portfolio, which follows from Stanford University making that announcement, the World Congress of Churches and the Rockefellers and various others. It seems like there's real momentum growing around divesting it from fossil fuels and moving investments into renewable energy, which is part of a movement of citizens as well as certain corporations and institutions. And I think that that's a positive development. I think that similarly in renewables, the money shifted very quickly in the renewable space in the last 5 or so years, particularly in PV, but overseas also in other areas too. And I think that's important. In the Australian context, we had, during the carbon tax debate where it was very toxic, that's where I think a lot of the public disengaged from the climate change issue, but it wasn't that the public opinion research shows that it wasn't that people were negative about the issue as much as they were just negative about the way the conversation was proceeding. And it's been interesting to look at public opinion research in the last, I suppose, since middle of 2012. There's been a growing concern, and that's mirrored across a whole bunch of different polls. And I think that will just continue to increase, particularly if we continue to see the sort of extreme weather that we've seen the last 2 summers, the Blue Mountains bushfires last year that everyone would remember that were very, very large and very early in the season. So I think that the Australian public is more concerned than they were previously. Internationally, there's a lot of stuff going on. The US and China are really pushing forward in a way that they weren't a few years ago. And I think the G20 will be an interesting experience for Australia, whether it will probably be behind the scenes, but the pressure that will come from the US and China, and we've heard that from our colleagues in the US, that there will be pressure brought to bear in those forums. But then finally, we have a sort of schizophrenic political dynamic in both of the major parties, where they both say, this is a serious issue, we're serious about dealing with it, but they also say, coal's good for humanity, coal is got a bright future in Australia forever, and things like that. So both major parties are absolute rusted on coal advocates, and this is at a state level and a federal level. And I think the transition to realising we have to keep roughly 80% of the coal in the ground. Like, we just can't burn most of the stuff that we have, and we have a lot of it in Australia. And that's...
What are we, Jen? We 78% coal in the electricity generation? Yeah,
it's around about that.
Yeah, it's around that. Yeah.
And, you know, the amount that we're exporting far exceeds that. So we have a responsibility internationally in terms of what we're going to do. So I think that the coal question will be the big question for Australia in the next few years, and whether the major parties can navigate their future and how they're going to deal with having a climate policy, but a policy that's super supportive of coal.
Yeah, I would very much support what you're saying, and I think that the international movement, you know, especially by China and the US, as you just commented, is really gathering momentum. And I've noticed the Pentagon came out this morning and said climate change is a massive threat to security right now. Not in the future, but right now, and they want something doing about it. So, you know, once those types of institutions start making those types of comments, Australia is going to find itself in an untenably backward position, and we'll be forced to make changes.
Interestingly, in the States, they've gone down the regulation path, is the proposal. So where are the two biggest emissions? Stationary energy, i.e. electricity, and transport. So they're regulating standards for new build electricity and regulating vehicle standards, rather than the Australian politics got held up on the design of the mechanism rather than the result that it was trying to get.
That's right, yeah.
And the media seems to play into this too. They flip-flop as well in with messages that they advocate, which is really annoying. There isn't a clarity in terms of what they're advocating to the public, so they play politics as well.
Yeah.
Thank you. Wendy.
Hi, Wendy Hurt, I'm from TAFE. I was actually going to ask a question about politics, but you've pretty much answered that, thank you very much. So I'll very much put it to you, you'll probably find that everyone here is interested in climate change, and therefore you're preaching to the converted. And I know I was at a conference for building sustainability at TAFE Illawarra a month ago about their solar decathlon program, and again, preaching to the converted. How do you get the message out to... Can't always put an article in the Telegraph and have it in the Daily Telegraph and not have it manipulated. But do you think there's a scope for someone like a new version of what was it towards 2000, or have Richard Hammond do a great? I use his things from engineering classes, but they're someone, whether it's our Governor General or David Attenborough, someone more visionary to come in and try get the message across, who people don't hate like they do hate some of the current climate people.
Can I tackle that one initially? When we're travelling around the country with the Climate Commission and now with the Climate Council, we're often accused, I would say, of preaching to the converted. When we started on the Climate Commission, the CSIRO presented us at our very first meeting in Parliament House. This is even before Amanda's time, with a big pie chart which showed public attitudes to climate change. This is back in 2010, 2011. And it had the little wedge of about 10% hardcore denialists, and then the rest was sort of roughly 50-50, sort of 45-45, of the people that recognised the climate was changing and that human activities were responsible, and then an almost equivalent size chunk of the pie of people that thought the climate was changing but were not convinced that human activities were causing it. And at the time, I really felt, okay, well, the Climate Commission's audience is that 45% that think the climate's changing but are not convinced of the cause. And I went into my thinking about communication with that sort of frame. Having done this now for several years, I don't think that at all, in fact. I mean, it'd be nice to convert those people, get them across the line. I think we absolutely have to preach to the converted, because it's the converted that are the ones that are going to do something. So people often say, oh, but what do you say to all the denialists out there that, you know, sceptics about climate change? I say nothing. I don't say anything to them. I don't care what they think. No, I'm serious. I've only got so many minutes in the day to do this, and those people, it doesn't matter how many facts I present to them from a scientific perspective, they are not going to change their mind. It is a religion. So, you know, let's not waste our time. Converting some of the unconverted to the converted would be good, but really we only need 50% of the population. We need 50. If we had 50% of the population who were so concerned about climate change that they went and bought solar panels and put them on the roof, or paid for green power if they were renting, they divested their superannuation from fossil fuels, they changed their bank accounts to a non-fossil fuel investing bank, and they wrote to their local member and said, I'm only going to vote for you at the next election if you have a decent climate change policy. If we had 11 million people do that, that's all we need. So absolutely preaching to the converted is what we must do, because they are the ones that are going to do something. That's my view now.
I've started preaching to my 11-year-old child, Lesley. He had an assignment to do for today, and it was about what's my biggest concern for the future. And his biggest concern was the world being taken over by robots. Well, I spent 2 hours with him, and by the end of it, there was a whole speech of climate change. So I think starting young is pretty good too.
So any more questions from any of you, or comments about things that have been raised?
Sorry, can I just ask it from here?
Yeah, sure.
You were just talking about ways that we can do practical things to, like, an everyday person could do something practical. Is there any other suggestions that you would have? You mentioned the bank and the superannuation, that sort of thing.
Well, I have to be careful because I can recommend a whole bunch of stuff that I'm not very good at doing. So, not driving my car, becoming a vegetarian, which I'm not. Those sorts of things actually do matter, en masse, not individually, but en masse. But having your voice heard, becoming an agitator, Amanda became a climate change communicator and started a group that's now got over 100,000 members, with one or two other people. So we were often asked in Climate Commission forums, well, what can I do? And I would always say to people, join a group, get involved in a local community group that's working on this issue. Don't be alone thinking that, all you can do is what you can do in your backyard, but join a group and get active.
Jenny, do you find this an issue? Because we've put on solar in our home, and after feeling the buzz about what we've done and seeing the results, we've tried to convert our neighbours who are quite affluent, but no, it hasn't taken root at all. They don't want to know about it.
We find that the biggest uptake of solar is what you call the mortgage belt. So the lower socio-economic, and again, it always goes back to the money. They're the ones who look at the electricity bill and go, how am I going to pay this? We don't sell as much in South Australia and those richer eastern suburbs, because the theory is that they look at the electricity bill, that's $1,000, not a problem, and they just pay the damn thing. And so that's a bit of a challenge. Again, it just goes back to that apathy. If they can afford it, it's a bit difficult. We do a lot of lobbying. Well, I personally do a lot of lobbying. And also as much education as we can. So again, it's mainly to the converted, but we're always putting out even just general things, social media, Facebook feeds, Twitter. We send newsletters out to not only our customer base, that's wholesale, residential and commercial, but we've got thousands of people on our database who we contacted at one stage or another, and maybe they didn't get solar, or maybe they got it through someone else. We don't care. We still send them information so they know what's going on. We invite them to the rallies, and we let them know what's going on to try and increase that, that exposure, basically. But I've also got to say that there are people who just think solar's a crock. Yeah. It doesn't work. I know someone who put it on and they still had a high electricity bill and it didn't make a difference. And unfortunately, solar has got such a bad reputation in Australia. There were too many cowboys. It was a bit like the insulation. Really good incentives brings everyone out of the woodwork. So it was very damaging for us as well. And it's very hard to convince those people who just don't see it. And I've got, friends of mine, my dad didn't believe in it at all, put solar on anyway because he was supporting his daughter who was starting her own business. It took him probably about 3 to 4 months, and then he comes back to me and goes, so can you put some more on the roof, and can you do your grandmothers, and can you do your uncles? And my whole family's converted now, but even my own dad just went, no, it's a crock, it doesn't actually make any money, and it's no good, and anything else. So even just getting them along the line, and then showing them other ways they can save on electricity. Like, again, it's all about reducing your emissions. So LED lighting, look at how you heat your house. Do you really need to have that air conditioner on? Just put the fan on or open the door. It's cooler outside than it is inside. Just really basic things that we tell our customers every day, try and help them.
I think it's worth saying that we're all creatures of repetition, and although it can feel like people have heard this message before, we need to hear it over and over again. And there's a reason religions say the same thing over and over again, and they have holidays at different times of the year to teach people the same thing every year for their whole life. It's because we get lazy, we don't necessarily want to do things that perhaps like not turn the air conditioning on, turn the fan on. We need to be reminded of what's important when we've got so much else going on in our lives. So that's why we've put out reports saying basically the same thing for 4 years. We've said the same thing in a myriad of different ways. Basically, climate change is really important. We need to do something about it. But you can't say that exactly every time. So there's bushfires and there's heat waves and there's this and there's...
You know what we need is it's in the numbers. I mean, Dad was convinced when he saw the numbers. So when you turn off the air conditioner, if dollar bills came out the power line,
that would be good. Well, I remember the UK when I lived there. This was some 20 odd years ago. You had to put 50p in for your power, and you know it sort of made you feel really little. That you paid for every hour of energy that you got. I think that's a good way of doing it.
And I've got to say, that's what we're doing. We've created a system where you can monitor not only your output of your solar, because that's important. A lot of people have panels on their roof, they don't know whether they're working or not. So, but also just monitor your energy usage. So, because the idea is if you can educate people and if they can identify where they're using power, how they're using power, they're more likely to change their habits. So, you know, because people just get their electricity bill after 3 months and go, oh, shit. Jeez, what happened there?
Oh, it's someone else's fault. It's like my provider is.
Yeah, but if you can give them a report, you know, a daily graph to show when they're using their power, and they go, oh, at 4 o'clock every day my power spikes. That's when the kids come home, turn on the 5 TVs and the 2 lights and blah, 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 blah. Right, I'm going to get onto them because that's affecting my usage. And it's the same for businesses as well, you know, providing them those types of reports. They can go, well, I've had a peak here. That's because everyone's turning on all these machineries. That one uses a lot of power. I guess it's getting pretty old. Maybe I should upgrade it for a new one. And of course, we, again, put this back to dollars because that's what they care about. That's what they understand. And it's terrible that, look, all of the greenies and the people who cared about solar got it years ago when it was really expensive, I have to say, you know. And now, to be able to implement this change and get people thinking about it, you've got to hit them where it hurts, so to speak. So
I heard a report just this week or last week. WA had the greatest penetration of solar. I think it was, you know, certainly in Australia, but maybe more broadly than that. In the 80s, was it?
Yeah, WA's always had a very strong uptake of solar, and because we've got so much sunshine.
Yeah. And
when I was working for the Renewable Energy Advisory Council, we surveyed people's attitude to solar hot water systems. We didn't have solar panels in those days, or photovoltaic panels. And it was interesting listening to you talk because the uptake was not high amongst the very, very poor people, they just didn't have the money to do it. But nor was it high amongst the very, very wealthy, which is what you're saying, because they just really didn't care about spending the extra money. The uptake was high in that central demographic where people could see they could make a bit of a difference to their power bill. And so, yeah, it was, WA's had a very strong uptake, and we've got a strong uptake.
20% and now it's back down to 5%? It was something
with
solar hot water.
No, I don't think it's back down to 5.
Well, but it was very high.
It was up to about 28% at one stage. It's probably less than that now.
Yeah.
But that's because we've got very cheap gas as well. So
fantastic.
Yeah, that's good for Santos.
Yeah, that's good.
But yeah, so gas is very cheap. But one thing that's worked for us, getting back to your question there, is a neighbourhood scale. You can join a group, or you can promote your own neighbourhood to be more sustainable and to use solar and do other activities like that. We've got a great little neighbourhood, and we're based around a park, and there's a lot of connectivity between the neighbours, and we have regular picnics at the park and barbecues and that sort of thing. And the ideas around sustainable gardening and photovoltaics really spread through that networking process. There are 2 or 3 people living around the park who are very strong on sustainability, and the others who are just kind of lukewarm. But you know, it's an opportunity to either be a champion or to join up with another champion and try to affect people who are possibly open to the idea of change, but you know, don't have the energy to do it by themselves, or can't be bothered to get the information for themselves. So yeah, I think a community or neighbourhood scale is a good place to begin.
Can I just make a comment on that? Because there's a whole lot of things, I mean, coming from a politics background, there's a whole lot of things we cannot do as individuals. We can't put in a decent public mass transport system, you know, so I think we have to have both. I think it's really good. We have to have behavioural change, but we also have to have policy change so that politicians realise there's pressure, there's demands for public transport, that they may lose their seat, you know, they may lose an election because, for say, in Melbourne, where I come from with the East-West Tunnel, you know, that. So I think it's both, but I do think that it's a bit of a fantasy if we think that we can do it without some actual change at the upper levels on things like the big ways in which energy is distributed, and it may be we can do, you know, that as once we get batteries where we can store power, that things will shift fast. But in terms of transport, we actually need big public investment in public transport systems.
It's a ratcheting forward system though, isn't it? Because politicians are responsive to what the community thinks.
Yeah,
and then the community's driven by what politics and policy does.
But the problem is that politicians, I mean, there's always a whole lot of different things that people are voting on. You know, there's quite a lot of support for public transport in Victoria at the moment. It doesn't mean that we're getting it. You know, there's a whole lot of other issues, you know. I mean, I think that's...
And another big player here is the market. So I'm quite excited about how fast markets can move.
Yeah, I think that's...
And what's the role of governments tweaking them there? And, you know, I helped write the South Australia's Greenhouse Strategy 10 years ago, and then our latest effort, which I've had a lot to do with, was South Australia's Climate Change Vision, and that has a lot more in it about change is inevitable, climate change will change our lives. Where is South Australia going to position itself to actually benefit from the change? Let's get ahead. Let's look at the role of government in driving that innovation and that leading edge stuff. If we work on solving our own problems, we will solve problems for a broader place than just South Australia, and we'll have solutions we can sell to the world. So that was the positive message around making markets work for us, and I'm a great fan of people need change to be easy for them. And markets make stuff easy for people in so many different ways. Markets have transformed the solar industry, but let's not pretend it did it without government support. You know, Germany has to take a lot of credit for driving change, global change in the solar industry. So, you know, some of that I think is another big player, and I totally agree with you about government infrastructure, markets and community. You know, they're all really big pieces of the puzzle here.
I just wanted to ask how the standalone solar systems are taking off. And I know battery development is a big thing with that, but are you seeing people wanting to have their own standalone energy, be off the grid more, or you know?
Definitely. People are wanting to do it. I guess the challenge at the moment is storage is still very expensive. So we get a lot of inquiries about it.
So what would it be for a house? Would it be 15,000 or 20,000?
Minimum, yeah. So we actually do storage systems, but they're generally for people who are off grid and don't have access to the grid at all. And that's because it is still cheaper to buy electricity than it is to store it. So unless you don't have any other option, or you're using it as a redundancy, you know, a backup solution instead of a generator, we do have some people who do that as well. Or unless you've just got a heck of a load of money and you want to stick it up the retailers, and I've got to say we've got a couple of them too, it's just not there yet. Until we can get storage, and basically it's the batteries that cost the money, until you can get that to be at parity or cheaper than buying electricity, it's really not going to hit off. And we think that that's still at least a few years.
That's where government policy is important, sending the right messages, and you know, if subsidies were removed, the direct and indirect subsidies were removed from, say, the coal and industry, then you know suddenly the apparent difference would change quite dramatically.
I guess I'll make one just very brief comment in terms of transport. I unfortunately had a car accident early this year and ended up diverting to public transport almost coincidentally, and I've now been without a car since February. And it's been quite an interesting shift for me in terms of living in a regional area where public transport is fairly poor. And I guess I just wanted to share that, you know, it's once you get used to it, it's not as difficult as it may seem, and you know, I think the state government has a lot to do to improve our public transport system still. But yeah, I guess I just wanted to share that, you know, having a shift imposed on you sometimes is, you know, an interesting experience, and sometimes a positive one in terms of all that time is valuable. So I often work during that time. The other thing I guess I wanted to ask was around community energy, but I am aware that sort of we're sort of over time now. But I guess I was interested in whether there was any comments to be made about a shift towards community renewables. Maybe from the Climate Council's perspective, is there anything being done to support strategies in that sort of space?
We're not doing anything specifically to support that space, but I think that there's a lot happening. And Hepburn Wind Farm in Victoria is a good example of the community coming together and putting wind turbines to power the community. And I think we'll see a lot more of that into the future, but it will depend a lot on where the policy, the renewable energy policy, ends up as to whether they're financially feasible.
There's a community energy community building their own resources. So on the back of Hepburn Springs, there's an Embark website for community energy advocates, and what we've seen is a number of groups form on the back of, they're part of this bigger community, but there's People's Choice Solar. I've just joined Carina, which is a charity model for funding renewable energy. There's about 4 or 5 different initiatives, all looking at progressing a different part of the puzzle. So I think it's a really interesting space.
Yeah, and there's the ones, and Heather, you know more about it than I, but where basically they'll put the solar on your roof and they'll take all of the credits, and then you get it back after 10 years. And so it's because it's the capital cost up front that people are struggling with. So there are all these sorts of things through the community ones. It's sort of like they're leasing your roof space.
Yeah, there's quite a few interesting business models, and there'll be a bit of toing and froing with regulation and how they come in. You know, the first people will always sort of have to break ground in terms of how things are seen in the sector.
Thank you very much. Judith, perhaps you're last.
To ask the panel generally in relation to, we focused on energy as being a major factor, and we all agree with that. There are some other factors as well that are having a huge impact in relation to climate change, and I'd like to see what the panel think about some of those. In relation to industries, we're focused only on energy, but there are a whole lot of other industries that are having a huge impact in relation to that. And that whole economic paradigm which seems to drive this, rather than another paradigm which will look at social factors more seriously than we do now. Deforestation, for instance, looking at not only here but in the Amazon and other places where this is a major factor. If any of the panel would like to comment on those factors as well.
I'd just like to say quickly that yes, we do need a very different economic system. We need an economic system that is set within sustainability parameters, rather than an economic system that tells us how much sustainability we can currently afford.
Yeah, you make a good point about reforestation or deforestation and so forth. The emissions in the land sector and in the agricultural sector we need to look at as well. They'll need different policy solutions to what we have in the energy sector, but we need to look at the suite of emissions, and if we look at the breakdown of the Australian pie of emissions, we point to the rainforests and so forth, but we've got our own issues here as well.
You have.
Okay. Well, could you please join me in thanking our wonderful panelists? I'd also like to extend some special thanks to people who worked behind the scenes today. Leanne McKay, who has been videotaping this conversation and does a great job as a volunteer. Her work will be edited by her, and then I'll feature it on YouTube, so that if you'd like to get a link to it, just email me, and hopefully we will have a wider audience through YouTube. Also, Christine Langford, who's the lady who received you as you came in. Again, we're all volunteers at ACLW, so I'd like to thank her for her expertise in receiving you and in organising all the admin that went behind the scenes. And our wonderful musicians up the back there, Deanne Green and Emily Meath, if you could thank them as well. And just to end, a few notes of interest. ACLW is running a national award and receiving applications at this stage till the 29th of November. The award is called Sustaining Women's Empowerment in Communities and Organisations. I'd highly encourage you to have a look at this award. It's not only for women, it's for men as well who advocate for women and create pathways in workplaces and in communities. We've had this award run for over 4 years now, but prior to that, ACLW has run awards since 2004. Have a look at it because you might know someone you could nominate, or perhaps nominate yourself for one of those categories. And also there will be a book launch later in November. I've edited a book with about 6 authors on the topic of merit and quotas in the business world, in law, in education, finance and IT. I'd love you to come along to that book launch. But for now, thank you so much for being here. It's been delightful talking to you. I've learned a few things and I'm looking forward to continuing some discussions and seeing whether you'll be a baker. Susie.
That'd be awful.
So thank you so much for tonight and safe journey home.
I wrote your name down.
This is very bland. This is very bland because we wanted it. So we bounced it. Very See you later. Come along. It's not so much for gravitas.